We're here with our panel, former Green Party Communications and Policy Director David Cormack, Fairfax Political Editor Tracy Watkins and former ACT Party Leader Jamie Whyte. Well, Panama Papers developments this morning, and we've been waiting to hear what the Prime Minister has had to say about being named in this Leakers manifesto. Well, we've got something here from the Prime Minister. Let's take a look.
And we want to make sure our reputation as being, upfront on all of these matters is preserved. That's been the view of the OECD, and if there's something that tells us it's not, well, we'll look to make changes to resolve that.
Are you confident your name or none of your ministers will be in these lists on Monday?
I won't be in those lists. Look, these people have had these papers for a year looking through politicians. I know my own personal situation, and I can assure you if I'd been in it, or my ministers had been in it, we'd well and truly know by now.
Well, that was an interview that he gave to Fairfax. If I can come to you first, Tracy, he's pretty confident that he's not going to have anything else to worry about.
Well, yeah, he sort of makes the point that these papers have been out there for a long time, and if you see some of the developments this morning, the John Doe behind these papers has actually called out John Key personally, but in relation to the Cook Islands and matters that he can't really control. So I would have thought that if John Key was named in any of these documents, we would have known about it by now through some of the international media organisations.
Do you find it curious, Jamie, that this person, this leaker, has the world stage and they choose to highlight John Key?
I do find that curious, but I don't know what to read into it. I mean, it's odd to mention the Prime Minister of one country with regard to another country. So it is curious, but that's all I know about it.
Yeah, and we're expecting this other database to become available where we can search names, etc. Prime Minister, they're confident he's not going to be in it. Is any of this mud sticking to John Key, do you think, David?
Well, over the years, almost zero mud has stuck to John Key, so it'll be really interesting if anything now sticks. But things that dislodge governments tend to be whiffs of corruption, and this is starting to get a little bit of an odour about it. It's interesting to hear him say that if there's anything that comes up, we'll make some changes, and I would have thought that as the Prime Minister, he would know if New Zealand was in fact a tax haven.
And I think that's the first indication we've really had that he's talking about change now, and that suggests that they think it might do some damage.
But the trust, I don't think it can stick to Key. The trust regime in New Zealand was not created by the National Party, as he's pointed out on many occasions. New Zealand has all the normal kind of information sharing arrangements with other governments, and I just can't see. The worst you could say is that they've let something continue, but I don't think that was on their radar. It wasn't created by them. The issue's just come up.
But I think that's the issue with all governments, isn't it? Some things might have been created under someone else's watch, but when they come to a head, it's under your watch, and it's how you deal with it. That is how you're judged, I think. And they're not going to be able to just keep saying, well, this was something that Labor set up, so we don't need to do anything about it, because it's becoming a problem by the looks of the latest revelations.
And he hasn't dealt with it well, though, in this particular instance. He's kind of flip-flopped and vacillated on his relationship with the lawyer, who's suddenly not his lawyer, and the lawyer hasn't had anything to do with the Panama firms. But then in last night's story, we saw the lawyer actually wrote a reference for another law firm to be involved. So Key keeps changing his opinion.
Yeah, and it's just getting messy.
But come on, it is all rubbish. I mean, do you know? I don't know if you have a lawyer or not, but suppose you do. You probably don't know who his other clients are. I mean, you don't. How is Key supposed to know all this stuff? I mean,
there's
it's
sort of
ridiculous.
a higher standard expected of the Prime Minister than there is of perhaps most people.
But the Prime Minister literally cannot monitor these things.
No. And I think most people will take
clearly we're going to be talking about it for a few more weeks. So let's move on to health. Jonathan Coleman there couldn't get a straight answer as to whether health funding is increasing in real terms or not. Should he have been able to present that figure right there and then, Tracy?
Well, I think, this is when it comes down to health, and politicians do get incredibly tied up on the numbers games. And I think at the end of the day, you're looking at a budget of, what is it? It's 14.7 billion, and it could be 1 billion out, it could be 3 billion out, who knows? At the end of the day, what people will judge it on is whether someone in their family is getting treatment. And I think there is pressure building in the system. I think there are people who are not getting, hip operations or hernias and little things like that. I think that's where it starts to hurt government.
But isn't that always the case, David? It's one of those beasts that it's a problem for everyone, whichever party, supply and demand.
Absolutely. absolutely. And just to go back to your first question about whether he should have had the figures, when we were prepping Green MPs for interviews, we would do Q&A documents about what questions we would be anticipating, and the national comms machine is very slick, so I have no doubt that they would have done the same thing. So it's a question of, is it question evasion or question avoidance? And to me, I feel like it's probably a policy of disengagement. If he can just shoot past the tricky questions and just say what he wants to say, then that sells a better story. And to what Tracy was saying, she's dead right. Parties kick it around with numbers, but when it comes to, these are real human beings.
The announcement this week there's going to be extra funding for Pharmac, very clearly a large chunk of it's going to go on a melanoma drug. The Health Minister says there was no political pressure that came to bear there. Is he right, do you think?
Well, I have to believe him. You can't doubt government ministers. I think that's very deeply wrong. I'm joking, but I
not from him in particular, but from people.
I don't know. I've got to say, I just don't know. All I can say this is that the system, the Pharmac system, is I mean, I don't like government-funded systems at all. But if you're going to have one, you've got to have some way of making decisions about what treatments will be provided and which won't. And the system that Pharmac has is a good one within the constraints of a government system, and it shouldn't be undermined politically. That's to say, the decisions that they make should be done on the basis of the efficacy of the drugs.
Because some people would argue squeaky wheel.
Well, it does. It looks like there's been some political interference, and it is odd that the budget would be increased just at the point in time when there's a campaign to get a particular drug through and so on. And so I would regret that if that's what happened.
I'm not even sure if we would call it squeaky wheel. I mean, it's full-out lobbying, isn't it? And no one's hands are clean in this. I mean, National over Herceptin, Labour over Keytruda. I think the politicians have made a real mess of it. And I'm not sure if there's political pressure to... Well, I'm sure there was political pressure to fund a melanoma drug, but I think the way it worked is they said to Pharmac, how much money do you need to get this one over the line? And it was interesting that they didn't choose Keytruda, which was the subject of so much debate and controversy.
Just when you say no one's covered them in glory, I think you're kind of looking at it in a two-party way there.
Of course, the Greens.
The Greens, who are a very honourable party, they came out and said that Pharmac should not be touched. And I think I go to Jamie's point that there has sort of been an implicit pressure, and I don't think either of the two bigger parties have covered themselves in glory in this campaign.
Can I get you guys to come around to my view that we shouldn't have a government-run health system? Because one of the reasons the Greens have been clean on this is that they haven't been in the position of being on the receiving end of all this lobbying. There will inevitably be such lobbying, and there will inevitably be politicians who will succumb to it.
So, David, no publicly funded health systems, Jamie's solution?
Well, I find it interesting that Jamie says that's because the Greens have never been on the receiving end, but they've been in Parliament. But I think that a publicly funded health system is probably quite a good thing, particularly if, you know, you're not wealthy and sitting on $1 billion house in Auckland.
No.
Well, and you see what's happening.
How do you make
the health funding? It's a shambles. So.
The problem that's going on here is that we're struggling to make a decision about how much money to spend on healthcare. Right? That's the problem. That is ultimately the issue here. And the problem is that this decision is being centralised. So it's made by a government minister, and then it applies to everybody. In a private system, every individual makes that decision for themselves. It's got nothing to do with... If you want to help the poor, give them money. Right? Then they can make these decisions for themselves.
Right.
Instead, we give them free healthcare, but we give them healthcare that may or may not suit them.
Well, let's talk about another centralised decision that may be on the books, cannabis. Can you actually see a time, Tracy, when, you know, we might have a government monopoly on cannabis? You go into a shop and you purchase this, or where are we headed? No,
I just can't see that, to be honest. I mean, I can't see any government wanting to touch it, and I can't see what the upside would be. And I suppose you would ask yourself the question, if tobacco was illegal currently, would you legalise it? You know, and despite everything, I mean, there are health problems associated with cannabis, etc. And I'm not quite sure that it would solve any particular problems. But I can see the day when they might try and sort of, if you like, decriminalise it to the extent that you don't have the huge resources of police and the law system tied up in policing that.
It would solve a very big problem, which is there was a woman in Northland who was in prison for 2 years recently for possession of marijuana. She's a decent woman. She's in prison because she chose to consume something, and the state has imprisoned her. It is utterly outrageous.
Yeah, but who?
So it would solve that kind of a problem.
But how are we going to get change? Because the issue there is, as Tracy says, which party's going to touch it? Everybody backs away from it.
I mean, I hate to say this, but I agree with Jamie. I think that it would solve a very large problem as well. And you're right, it's a political problem at the moment, but we're seeing our current drugs czar show quite a liberal streak, and he seems to be pushing the national government about as far as they're prepared to go. And so I have some sympathy for him because I think he has got a desire for it to be liberalised further. However, we've got an inherently conservative government who probably aren't. So Labor have kind of talked about around the edges of it. The Greens party position is fairly well known. And so I think that if we get either a more libertarian government or a more left-wing government, progressive government, then we will actually see change.
I think if we had a private member's bill, you know, that might be the way for Parliament to address it without a government having to.
All right.
I'm amazed it's illegal today. Actually, in the 1990s, if you'd asked me,
I would have thought it would be
legalised by now, and I've been very surprised by the kind of almost reaction, movement in the other direction. And in my experience going around debating these kinds of issues and in politics, it seems to me that actually one of the driving forces against it is the Maori Party.
All right, well, briefly before we go, I do want to discuss what's been termed the brocracy, which is Winston Peters calling for the end of jobs for boys, and he says it mainly is boys. He describes mediocre politicians being rewarded with overseas postings. Has he got a point?
Well, yeah, except we do remember, of course, that there was a former NZ First MP who did get an overseas posting, and he wasn't a mediocre MP. That was the late Brian Donnelly. He was a fantastic MP, and he probably deserved that posting. Look, we've got a tradition of putting people out to pasture in diplomatic postings, and I don't think it's a particularly good tradition, and there's no reason to continue it. But, you know, it's part of the system, and all parties do it.